The heat was so intense it rippled through the air like a living creature, clawing at the sky as flames devoured the small suburban home. Thick smoke spiraled upward in a dark column visible for blocks, but no one seemed to notice the tiny silhouette of a child pressed against an upstairs window, her small hands banging helplessly against the glass. In that terrifying, breathless moment, when danger screamed louder than hope, a worn-out veteran named Caleb Rowan and his loyal service dog, Benton, were the only ones close enough, and brave enough, to see her. And everything changed in a single heartbeat. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Soul Moments Story right now. Your support keeps these real feeling stories alive. Caleb was on one of his quiet morning walks with Benton, the sun still gentle, casting warm gold across the quiet neighborhood. Most days were the same for him, slow steps, heavy thoughts, and memories he carried like old scars. He had served nearly 12 years in the army, and while he returned home in one piece, his spirit had been left scattered somewhere between dusty roads and sleepless nights. Benton, a black and brown shepherd mix with calm eyes, had been assigned to him during rehabilitation, meant to help ground him when panic and past memories became too much. These walks were their ritual, a fragile peace Caleb cherished. But on this particular day, peace shattered when Benton froze, ears pointed, body rigid. Caleb lifted his head just in time to see the thin stream of smoke curling from the upper floor of the pale blue house at the corner of Juniper Street. At first it looked like leftover morning mist, but then a flash of orange burst through the upstairs curtains. The explosion of flame was sudden, violent, and wrong for such a quiet morning. Before Caleb even realized he was running, his boots were pounding the pavement, Benton sprinting beside him, barking urgently toward the burning house. The closer they got, the stronger the blaze roared, crackling with a ferocity that grew by the second. Flames had already swallowed the front stairway, and smoke blasted out through the half-open door as if the house itself was exhaling panic. But it was the faint, muffled cry from above that froze Caleb's blood. He looked up and saw her, a little girl, maybe 7, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide and terrified behind the glass. She was trapped. Caleb didn't think, instinct took over. He had been in burning buildings before, though never meant to go back into one. But the sight of that little girl triggered something deep in him, a sense of duty, the memory of people he couldn't save, and the absolute refusal to add another regret to his heart. The front door was useless. Flames had already consumed it. Instead, Caleb circled the side of the house, searching desperately for anything, a ladder, a low shed, a drainpipe sturdy enough to climb. Benton barked continuously, running along the yard, as if trying to guide Caleb's frantic eyes to something useful. And then Caleb saw it, an old wooden trellis supporting a dying vine. It wasn't meant to hold a person's weight, but it was the only option. Caleb climbed, ignoring the way the wood groaned under him, ignoring the bite of heat on his skin as the fire spread. When he reached the window ledge, he smashed the glass with his elbow, using the thick sleeve of his jacket to shield the child from the shards. Smoke rushed out like a monstrous breath, but he reached in, grabbed the girl carefully, and pulled her close. Her tiny arms clung to him in instinctive fear, her body trembling violently. Climbing down with one arm was impossible, so Caleb did something reckless, something he later couldn't explain except by saying the moment demanded it. He held the girl tight against his chest, whispered a silent plea, and pushed off the wall, dropping the short distance to the ground. He twisted his body mid-fall to cushion her landing on top of him, taking the full impact of the ground against his own back. Benton rushed to them immediately, nudging Caleb's cheek as if checking he was still alive. The girl, miraculously, was unharmed except for a few smudges of soot and a scratch on her arm. Caleb, however, felt a stabbing pain shoot across his ribs and knew he'd likely injured something. But the relief that washed over him when he saw the girl breathing, crying, and alive overwhelmed every ache. He carried her away from the burning home as sirens finally screamed in the distance. Firefighters took over the scene, and paramedics urged Caleb to lie down so they could check him. But all he cared about was whether the girl would be okay. Her name, he eventually learned, was Marina Halden. The fire had broken out while her babysitter ran to the corner store. A faulty space heater in an upstairs room had triggered the blaze, and without anyone there to react fast, the fire spread far quicker than expected. Marina kept asking for her mother, her voice trembling every time her small hands clutched Caleb's sleeve. He reassured her, telling her she was safe now. His words were soft but steady, the kind of tone he hadn't used in years, not since he had taught younger soldiers how to stay calm under pressure. At the hospital, Caleb's injuries were examined, a cracked rib, minor burns, and smoke inhalation. Nothing that couldn't heal. Still, he felt odd lying in that crisp bed, the smell of antiseptic replacing the acrid smoke still clinging to his clothes. Benton lay at his feet, refusing to leave. The paramedics said he could go home once he was stable, and though he nodded, a quiet heaviness pressed against his chest. Saving Marina had filled him with purpose, a light he had forgotten he could feel. But now, alone in the sterile room, uncertainty crept back in. His life, after all, was still the same, a small apartment, few friends, a wounded mind navigating days that often blurred together. He wondered if this moment of heroism had been the only spark he'd feel for a long time. He didn't expect anyone to visit him. So when a tall woman in a sleek navy suit, her eyes red from crying but her posture sharp with composure, stepped into his room hours later, Caleb felt a jolt of surprise. She introduced herself as Vivian Halden, Marina's mother, CEO of Halden Robotics, a name he vaguely recognized from billboards and local business articles. She thanked him with a depth of emotion that seemed to tremble beneath her strong exterior. She said he had saved her entire world. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a check, and placed it carefully on the table beside him. Caleb blinked at the number. It was large, life-changing. Enough to pay off debts, repair his life, support his future. But her gesture wasn't what moved him most. What struck him was her expression, the helplessness behind her gratitude. She was powerful, influential, widely respected, yet completely undone by the thought of losing her daughter. It was a reminder that money, success, and authority meant nothing in the face of losing someone you loved. Caleb tried to refuse the check at first, insisting he didn't save Marina for a reward. Vivian nodded, saying she understood, but explained that this wasn't a payment. It was gratitude, a way to help someone who had risked everything without hesitation. She had read his background in the hospital chart, learned he was a veteran struggling to rebuild his life, and she insisted this was simply the right thing to do. Her sincerity softened the knot in Caleb's chest. He finally accepted, not out of greed, but because he realized sometimes people offered kindness for the same reason he had run into the fire, because humanity demanded it. When Marina woke later that afternoon, still groggy but safe, she asked for the man with the brave dog. Caleb, escorted to her room by a smiling nurse, watched as Marina's face lit up when she saw Benton. She hugged the dog tightly, and for a long moment Caleb stood there quietly, feeling his heart unspool in ways he didn't expect. It had been years since anyone looked at him with pure gratitude, unfiltered admiration, or even trust. Marina's tiny smile, gap-toothed, warm, and full of innocence, felt like sunlight breaking through a long, unending storm. Over the next few hours, Caleb learned more about Vivian. She had built her tech company from scratch while raising Marina alone after her husband passed away. She admitted she often felt guilty for not being home enough, juggling late meetings and international calls while trying to be present for her daughter. Caleb listened, understanding guilt intimately. Life had a way of making people feel like they were always falling short somewhere. But the fire, horrible as it was, had reminded both of them what truly mattered. Vivian later asked Caleb what he wanted to do next, whether he had any goals or dreams he'd abandoned because he felt stuck. It was a question he hadn't allowed himself to consider for years. But as he spoke, he surprised himself by admitting he'd always wanted to help other veterans adjust back to civilian life, to use Benton and his own experience to guide those who felt lost in the maze of trauma and transition. Vivian smiled at that, a smile filled with possibility. She told him the check was only the beginning. If he wanted to build something meaningful, she would help him connect with people who could support his mission. For the first time in years, Caleb felt like his life wasn't just something he endured, it was something he could shape, rebuild, and maybe even feel proud of again. As the day softened into late afternoon light, Caleb, dressed in fresh clothes the hospital provided, walked outside with Benton beside him. Vivian and Marina walked with them to the parking lot. Marina clutched Benton's fur, giggling softly as the dog nuzzled her. Caleb breathed in deeply, feeling the warm air settle in his lungs. The world seemed different, brighter, filled with quiet promise. He had gone from a quiet, lonely morning to an afternoon brimming with possibility. And it all began with a split-second decision made in the face of flames. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Soul Moments Story. Your engagement